In this episode, I'm going to walk you through the first P of the 6 Ps of highly productive people. Welcome to Leadership for Startups, where we help entrepreneurs and leaders build businesses that grow and flourish. My name is Toyo Shimbi, your host, and welcome to episode 8. In this episode, we are continuing. This is part 2 from our series, The 6 Ps of Highly Productive People. In the last episode, I introduced you to the 6 Ps and walked you through what they were, gave you the reasons why this is a very important topic for you as an entrepreneur and a leader to take note. We gave you the 4 future trends in leadership development, and you can listen to that in episode 7. You want to, first of all, check that out. And then I introduced you to the 6 Ps of highly productive people: principle-centered, personal development, purpose, priorities, productive, and people. And I promised that I was going to go through each one on the next number of episodes. So today we're going to be looking at principle-centered. Why is this important? Well, as a leader and as an entrepreneur, you're going to find out that this is perhaps one of the most important decisions that you are going to make, and that is the decision to be principle-centered. It actually is going to help you bring to life and set the pace of the culture of your organization. It is going to be helpful for you when it comes to making tough decisions, and it simply is going to serve you well, even though at the same time it might actually become one of the most challenging choices to make. Principle-centered. So first of all, what do we mean by principle-centered? Now, I know that a lot of companies these days have their core values, and I think it's become more of a trend now for companies to have their core values on their website. And yes, that is right. And I absolutely believe that that is important. But from my own experience, and this is something that maybe you might be able to relate to, just because a company has core values when you walk in on the wall doesn't necessarily mean that that's what you experience. Now, nobody is expecting perfection, and I think that would be quite wrong. So everybody makes mistakes, but I believe that the core values should be seen in the culture of the organization. And as for you as an entrepreneur, as a leader, especially in the startup stage, you set the tone for that. And you might not realize how powerful that is when you are in that position where you can actually set the tone of the culture of your organization right from the beginning. And it actually is based on this particular topic that we are looking at, which is in being principle-centered. So again, what do we mean by being principle-centered? Well, it is slightly different to when we use the term values. So when we talk about values, we're normally talking about the things that we value. And that could be anything. It could be riches. It could be wealth. It could be balance. It could be my family. It could be so many things that we value. And everybody has their choice of what they should value. And that's rightly so. Okay. But there's a distinction between what you value and what are principles. So the definition is that I'm going to define the principles as timeless laws of the universe. It's like gravity. You can't argue about it. And to give you an example, for instance, justice. Justice will always be right. Integrity, being integrous, is always the right thing. Honesty is always the best policy. Humility, as much as some people might challenge this, but it's been shown now that humility is the best form and the best criteria for the greatest leader. In fact, not only do we know this from history, but not so long ago, Jim Collins, in his famous book, Good to Great, who actually struggled against them looking into the characteristics of leaders when they first of all wanted to look into that area. But when his team pushed ahead, they found something fascinating, which was that the best leaders had the characteristic of humility. And that is what we would consider to be a timeless principle. Things like trust, empathy. So the difference between values and principles are that what you are going to need to do is to value principles. And I hope you can get this. So it would be to have a set of values based on principles. Now, why again is this important? Well, I believe this is absolutely important for all of us, especially as we are looking into the future of the autonomous organization. And what do we mean by that? In episode 7, I mentioned that a leader for today needs to start thinking about how they can empower their people as quickly as possible. And as organizations become more flexible, more autonomy is going to be needed to be given to the worker. Now, when you have people that are naturally living by a set of values or principles, right, they don't need to be checked in all the time. And I'm guessing if you're a manager or leader and you're listening to this, one of the concerns sometimes that you have is, are the people actually doing things when I'm not around? And the only way you can actually be confident is when the people that you've hired have a set of values that are based on principles. But guess what? You role model that. You have to believe that first. So that's why we're talking to you, the leader, first, before in another episode, we'll talk about looking for people that are like-minded. And that is one of the strategies of how you can find people to build an effective team. But we'll come to that later on. But let's talk about you first, right? And this is something that all of us have to embrace, which is we need to value principles. And this is going to help when it comes to things like remote working. It's going to help when it comes to empowering your team. It's going to help when it comes to when we talk about aligning, when we talked in episode 5, we talked about the 4 core leadership roles every leader needs to master. Lead yourself, envision the future. We talked about aligning with systems and processes and developing your people. That's lead. And you can check that out in episode 5, where we go through that being your core areas of focus. And so in order for you to be able to do that successfully, having a set of principles would help you. So to choose to be principle centered. And that's what today's episode is all about. It is a solo cast again. And hopefully by the end of this session, you have a better idea of the kind of choices that you need to make. Now, again, thinking about the kind of situations that you're going to go through, I think it's important for me to highlight that being principle-centered isn't always going to be easy. John Huntsman, who was chairman of Huntsman's Chemical, shares his story about how he chose to sell 40% of the division of his company to Emerson Campen, who was chairman and CEO of Great Lakes. And so they had sealed a deal to sell that portion of the business for $54 million. Now, unfortunately, the company that was purchasing this, the Great Lakes, they had dragged their feet 6 months in and were now ready to purchase. But in between that time, what happened was that the raw materials had decreased substantially and profits had tripled for Huntsman. And so the value of actually what was being sold had now gone from 54 million to 250 million. And so Emerson calls John and says, well, I don't think I need to pay the full price, but definitely feel bad of paying the 54 million. Why don't we go halfway? And Huntsman, his reply was, nope, I shook hands on 54 million and that's what I'm going to accept. That is a tough choice. And you might not necessarily agree with that. But one thing was very clear about John Huntsman was that he was a principle-centered man, that his word was his bond. And those are the kind of reasons why when we talk about having core values in an organization, that you as the leader are going to actually need to make those tough decisions, sometimes that actually are filtered through those values. I've had experiences working with leaders that when it came to tough decisions, the values that they had on the wall, maybe in some situations right behind them, was ignored, and they weren't made in those moments. And people in the organization then realize that, well, these are values on the wall, but they're not really values in the hearts and minds of the people. And so for you as an entrepreneur, as the leader in this, your startup, those are the kind of tough decisions that you're going to need to make. But let me tell you, they're the decisions that you are better off making now, so that when you are faced with those situations, you already know the choice that you're going to make. Another story that's quite popular is Johnson & Johnson, where in 1982, for reasons not known, a person or persons replaced Tylenol extra strength capsules with cyanide-laced capsules. And so they released it out, and it got into all the pharmacies. And the story goes that the chairman, James Burke, as soon as he heard, he pulled all the products from the shelves, which cost them millions of dollars. But when he was asked how could he make such a quick decision that could have ruined the company, the answer was, well, I was only acting based on our core values that states to protect our customers above all else. And so they had a value that their purpose or what they valued was the protection and security of their customers over profits. And those are some of the tough decisions that you're most likely going to need to make at some point. And what we find is that when leaders haven't chosen what those principles are, they find it more difficult when those challenges occur. And so in this episode, it's simply to highlight what that might look like, give you some kind of framework to start thinking about if that's something that you haven't done, and how you can maintain it. Because just like all of us, myself including, sometimes I have to really filter through, okay, what is the best choice here? And I have to then come back to my principles and think, this is what I want to stand for. This is what I stand for. So let's give you some examples of different types of principles. So you might have, for instance, courage might be a principle that you hold on to. Could be diligence, could be confidence, could be commitment, positivity, kindness, generosity, compassion, faith, that you believe in things, mental agility. And I have created a list of principles that you can have so you can make your choice. And that's going to be at leadershipforstartups.com/principles. And you can go there and then you can download the PDF. You have to subscribe, and that will also just put you on our list so we can always update you with more podcasts. It's important for you to know that, first of all, having a list of principles and choosing them would be the first step. And then the second thing would be knowing that not all principles are the same. There are two different types of categories of principles. So, and then I'm going to give you an example of what it means when you have chosen your principles beforehand, and what it might look like when you haven't chosen your principles beforehand. And then we'll give you some actions of how to keep those principles at the forefront of your mind and heart. So those are what we're going to do in the next couple of minutes for this episode. So we'll look at different types of principles, right? There are two main types. We'll then give you some examples and then give you some actions that you can do so that this can be part of your self-leadership program. First of all, there are two types of principles. The first type is what I would consider to be performance principles. And I'm going to list them out, and then I'm going to hopefully help you see why they will be considered performance principles. So here's a list. It's not an exhaustive list, but it might give you an idea. So for instance, courage, self-discipline, responsibility, resilience, faith, diligence, learning, confidence, commitment, positivity, mental agility. Now, these are timeless principles that when you think about them, don't we always want to be courageous? Isn't it a good thing to be courageous? Isn't it a good thing to be diligent, to be committed, to be confident, to be positive? I'm almost guessing that you're saying, yeah, absolutely. Give me some of that. Yeah. But they are what I would consider to be performance principles. This is something that I learned from Jim Lowe in his book, The Only Way to Win, how building character drives higher achievements and greater fulfillment in business and life. And I'll put a link to that book in the show notes. But what he was able to identify that there are two types of ways of how we become effective. One of them is within ourselves. And the reason why these would be considered to be performance principles is that what you'll find is that it's more to do about you and your own mindset. We talked about courage. We talked about self-discipline, responsibility, resilience. That's a lot to do with you. Now, the second type of principles, you're going to see there's something slightly different. Honesty, kindness, generosity, patience, compassion, justice, empathy, service, respect, gratefulness, transparency, honor. Now, what do you notice about those principles? Again, honesty is the best policy. Kindness is a good thing, to be kind, to be generous, to be patient. Give me some of that. Yeah. Compassionate, to execute justice, to have empathy. Again, these are timeless principles, right? That most of us will agree that if we had these as our values, that it's a good thing. But there's a distinction, isn't there? What you notice is that the first set were more about us. The second have to do with other people. So I call this group people principles. To be honest is to be honest with yourself, but also honest with others. To be kind. You can't be kind in isolation. You can't be generous in isolation. Neither can you be patient in isolation. So we find that these are two important categories of principles that I think that it's highly important that we choose a section from both so that we get the balance. Because if you focus only on one area, you find out that the other area gets neglected. Most leaders focus on courage, diligence, self-discipline, commitment, and get on with it and drive for results, and neglect sometimes the people principles, which is the kindness and generosity, the patience and compassion. And as a leader, you're going to need to have both if you want people to follow you. So even if people buy into your vision, they're still going to need you to have that compassion, to have that empathy. Now, we know that there's some leaders that their strength is more on the people principle, the honesty, the kindness, the generosity, the patience. And then where they fall down would be in their own diligence, in their own resilience, in their own courage. And so their leadership becomes weak because when it comes to the moment of truth, of speaking the truth in love, being courageous, being responsible, being confident, it's lacking. And so we need both. Now, how can we move forward on this, and how can we make this practical? Well, first of all, let's look at the importance of making this decision up front. A really good example would be in 2005 at the Italian Masters. Andy Roddick, who was a famous tennis champion for America at the time, was paired against Fernando Verdasco from Spain. And it was match point in favor of Roddick. Some of you might remember this, when Verdasco hit his second serve. The line judge called the ball out, and the crowd began to cheer for Roddick. Verdasco moved towards the net, wanting to shake hands, thinking it was over, but instead Andy Roddick didn't accept the point. Instead, he said that the ball was in and called the umpire's attention to a slight indentation on the clay court, which showed that the ball had landed on, not beyond the line. Surprised, the umpire allowed Roddick to overrule him, and the point was awarded to Verdasco. And in shock, Roddick ended up losing that match. Right. Now, it didn't go in his favor, but Roddick would have slept well that night because he followed his principles. Honesty is the best policy. Integrity is the best way. And as much as that might be challenging, one thing that you would know is next time you're doing something with Andy Roddick and he says, I saw this or I did that, you're going to believe him because he has earned people's trust. And as a leader, this is an important story for you to have that in mind, which is that you want to earn people's trust. But more important, when did Andy Roddick choose to be a person of integrity? Obviously, it wasn't in that moment. He'd already chosen that that's how he wanted to operate. He wanted to leave the tennis court knowing that he played fairly and squarely. I think it is the same with you as a leader in your startup, that now is the time to make those decisions of how you want to operate. Yes, your business might become a multi-million-dollar company in the next number of years, and you're going to be faced with some of these decisions, and it's in those moments that you're going to be put to the test whether the principles that you have embraced, that you're actually following through on them. The second story, it comes from a book titled What Got You Here Won't Get You There by Marshall Goldsmith. It's about a successful CEO of a food company. He's a brilliant, hardworking expert in his field. He's grown through the ranks to reach this level of CEO, and he's with his design team. And as he sees the product that they've created, he just makes a comment. And he said, what about changing it to baby blue? He says, blue is like an expensive upmarket color. Why don't you try that? And so the design team go away, and then they come back a few weeks later and they present it to him. And then the CEO's name is Carlos, and he says, yeah, it looks good, but I think red would actually be better. Now, the design team roll their eyes again. They're confused and they don't know what to do. Now, the story highlights the importance of leaders realizing their influence, the power of their influence, and that if they haven't created an understanding of the kind of ways decisions are made, whether it is a democracy, whether it is I make the final decision, or whatever way it is, but that the leader actually has a huge influence even when they walk in the room. And how can you then create a different dynamic? So in this specific scenario with Carlos, the CEO, if he was given feedback, for instance, that, he doesn't really listen, or he gets himself involved in things that aren't really his expertise, right? How is he going to take that feedback? And that's a question when I train people. It's one of the questions that we debate about taking feedback. And one thing that we do know is that if you get feedback that is constructive, or as my friend Chris Chin mentions of adjustment feedback, and you can listen more about feedback in episode 2, The Gift of Collaborative Feedback with Chris Chin. The reason why he might not take the feedback is because he hasn't chosen what he stands for. And I think, again, this is such a pivotal decision that we all need to make as leaders upfront, which is, what do we want to stand for? So in the scenario with Carlos, if humility was one of the principles that he chose that he wants to stand for, and if it was also transparency as well as learning, if it was learning as a principle, then he's more likely to take on board the feedback. But what about if he doesn't have a template? What about if he has never thought about what he stands for? Can you see how more difficult it would be for him to embrace any kind of feedback? What's our point? The point is that we want you to choose a set of principles to stand for. Now, how many? Now, there's so many principles to stand for, and realistically, you're most likely going to hinge on 2 or 3, maximum 4 that you're going to really have as your core. But you're also going to find out that there are a group of principles overall that will be important to you and that would actually lead into more character qualities, because really the principles that you're most likely going to end up embracing would end up being more character qualities that you want to live by. A good way of how you can do this and make it practical is to actually select 13 different principles. One of them, first of all, being self-discipline, because it's the self-discipline that is going to help you put the rest in place. And then I would then suggest selecting 6 from performance principles and 6 from people principles. And by doing that, you would then have a good balance around how you are where you're focusing on. So one of them would be more about your performance, and that's for you. And the other would be more the people principles, which is going to help you engage with others. Now, Benjamin Franklin gives us a fantastic structure of something that he did. What he did, he had what he called 13 virtues. And what he would do to keep track was that he had a small book and he had a chart of 13 of the virtues on the table. And every day, at the end of each day, he would sort of assess himself of how did he do, with one of them being the major focus. Now, that might be a lot for you. And so what I would simply suggest is each week you select one of those principles. And at the end of the day or at the end of the week, you simply ask yourself 2 or 3, maximum 5 questions. How did you demonstrate in this area? And by doing that, you're able to assess. So if it was, for instance, courage, it could be, have I been courageous this week? Have I made courageous decisions? If it's in the area of people principles, it could be generosity. Have I been generous? Have I been generous with my time? Have I been patient? Have I had empathy for my staff or for the people around me? And if you rotate each week and you mix it up, so one week it's performance principle, the next week it's people principle, by the end of the 13 weeks, you would have gone through all of these principles. And the 13th week, you can do an assessment. That could be self-discipline, just to cross-check and everything. And then you can go back in for the next quarter. And the 13 weeks is a good timeline because that's 90 days. So if you start in January, you finish your first section by the end of March, and then you continue April, May, June, and then another July, August, September, and then October, November, December. And that means that you would have gone through 4 times in the year each area that you have said is important to you. And that would be a good assessment. But we can talk about that maybe later on in a different episode. But I hope this has helped in terms of identifying the principles that you as a leader can live by. And as I said, we're going to give you a list of principles. So you go to leadershipforstartups.com/principles with an S, and put your name, your email, and download the PDF that I've created for you. Select 6 from the performance, 6 from the people, and choose the self-discipline as the 13th principle, because that's what you're going to need to get the other ones going. And then create out of that. You define it yourself. I'm not going to give you the definition of what patience is to you. I would encourage you to do your own research around the 6, the whole 12 that you've chosen, and then create some questions around them, and then choose one each week, and that will get you on track for you to be a principle-centered person. Well, that's it for today's show. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please subscribe. And also, if you can rate and review this podcast on iTunes, that will help a lot in terms of getting the word out there. And also, if you want to share this with your friends and colleagues or any leader of a startup that you know, please pass this on to them. And in addition to that, specifically today, you can go to leadershipforstartups.com/principles and put your name and email address, download the PDF, and select your principles. Next episode, we're going to be looking at personal development in the 6 P's of highly productive people. Stay tuned for that, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you.